the aisle. We will now hand the dialogue session over to Mr. Gerald Singham, the chair of the panel.
Good evening. Welcome back from our tea reception for this panel discussion. We indeed have a very, very formidable panel. We have individuals who have their own experiences, who have gone through their own journeys, who have seen history, and who now want to have a vision and a very positive vision of the future. My only regret for this panel discussion is, understand we only have about 45 minutes. But I think from the experience shared, especially from our two speakers earlier this afternoon, and I'm sure we would have loved to hear more from our minister as to the way forward. I wish that we probably had about maybe 15 hours rather than just the 45, 50 minutes that we have. But without any further delay, I know that during the tea break, I was approached by several of our friends and colleagues here to ask certain questions, and I said, I'm not the expert, let's leave it to the experts on the panel. So without any further delay, can we have the first question to our panel? Could you just please give your name and the grassroots organization or the organization that you're from, please? Yes, sir.
I'm Nasir Ghani from West Coast IRC. My question is with regard to the lesson that we can draw from Bosnia, the war experience. We do understand that after the breakup of Yugoslavia by the former president, the late President Tito, the country went into a civil war where nationalism prevailed, and during nationalism, as part of nationalism, they started blaming each other. So my concern is, in our own cabinet, we have ministers who may come from different faith, different religious group, where would there come a time when our cabinet or the national leaders may want to put forth their personal interest at a cost of nation and people? What safeguard can we put forth to ensure that such things do not happen? What with the popular votes coming in for the oppositions, would we see a day when we put up the wrong people who may twist the nature of history for Singapore? These are some concerns which I had felt with tremor and worry from what I heard from the experience of Bosnia. It's just my comment. Thank you.
I assume the question must be to the minister, right? Minister, would you like to share some thoughts?
First, thank you for the question. I think it's a very serious issue. Just make a couple of points in response. I agree with what you say. It's a serious challenge. The first thing that we all have to decide, we as in fellow Singaporeans, is how do we define our sense of identity? You know, usually, if you ask anybody in any country, there are two ways to define your sense of identity. One is to look at the past, and one is to look at the future. If you look at the past, for countries and nations with a rather homogeneous population and a unified religion, that tends to be a bit easier. For countries that have people from all walks of life, different races, different historical background, that is very difficult to define based on our past. But having said that, we don't want to lose our past, but perhaps a more meaningful and uplifting way is to define a common future. And if you look at the history of Singapore, it's very hard for us to define a common identity from what we know as a common past. Our history is very short. Our ancestors all come from different land. We speak a different language. Our skin colors are different and so on and so forth. But having said that, there's always a chance for us to define a common future. A future where we have a shared sense of purpose, a set of shared values, and I think that will put us in good stead. If you look at the history and experience of perhaps even the US, it's also largely similar. Very hard for them to define a common past. They have their ancestry come from the Germans, the Irish, the British, and so on and so forth. And nowadays, including the Hispanics, the Asians, and so forth. So it's very difficult for many countries of this nature to define the identity by a common past. But perhaps I suggest it's perhaps more uplifting for us to see what we can do to define a common future. To your second point, you ask, how can we safeguard this state of affairs whereby even if we define our identity with a common future, how do you get the correct people into the leadership? And this is really a big challenge. I would say that it requires two things. One, for the current set of leaders to be able to identify and groom the next set of leaders with the correct set of values. That's critical. To identify them and to be able to groom them. That is only half the equation. The other half of the equation, it requires leadership for us to convince the population that indeed the leaders with this kind of values are the ones that are deserving of their support, and not those leaders that play on either the racial or the religious card that serve to divide. This is the difference between politicians and political leaders. We all hope to have more political leaders and not just politicians who exploit the sentiments of the day. Perhaps in English, the word politician and political leader is a bit different. I always know that in Bahasa, Indonesia, I used to speak Bahasa quite. There's a difference in the term. One is politikus, which is politician. The other one is negarawan, which is a statesman. A statesman, a political leader that goes and rises above the current, that seeks to draw people together. So they have a different term for this. And in Indonesia, they look at the politikus, the politician, with disdain. Because politikus, the end off with tikus. Tikus in Indonesia means rats, mouse. So they look at the politikus with disdain. But they always seek the negarawan, which is the statesman. I think in Chinese, they also have a slightly different term for this. The Chinese, they call it 政客. 政客 is the politician, which is, it sounds like you're just an opportunist. Or you call it a 政界领袖, which is a leader. And that is where the role of leadership comes in. To find the correct people and groom them, and to make sure that we convince our people that we need to select people who serve to unite and bring us forward, rather than to serve to divide and bring us back, or to split us apart. So it's not a given. It's not a given. And if we look at the history around the world, I think there are many examples that will cause us to pause and cause us to reflect, to be careful. Because it is always easier to seek to find issues of the day, to stir emotions, and perhaps inadvertently split. And that comes to the other way that we can define our national identity, which is it an inclusive identity or is it an exclusive identity? Most countries define their identity using the exclusive method. It's against somebody, it's against a particular cause. It's always easier psychologically to identify a common enemy and to have a boogeyman and so on and so forth to do that. But to define our identity by being inclusive, being open, and yet anchored in what we believe in, that is a challenge. And I think if you look at Singapore, we will have our time in this journey of the history of nation that we have to go through this stage as well. We have been fortunate so far, since the 1960s, that our relative economic success has bought us time and space to develop this sense of identity. Supposing our economy development was not as robust as what we had, then perhaps we would have faced this challenge even much, much earlier. But let us make full use of this opportunity that we have over these years to make sure that we build that sense of value and identity that will help us to transcend the tough times that may come in the future. And that was what I shared with the Parliament about 2 days ago. The economic success has brought us relative space to build that sense of identity for a young nation. And hopefully that sense of identity, that sense of bonding, that sense of cohesion will allow us to ride through the tough times in the future when economic growth slows, the competition for resources becomes more intensified, the competition with other people becomes more intensified.
Thank you, Minister. If I can follow on this theme of leaders and leadership, and if I can put this question to Ambassador Yaacob, I learned something when I spoke to Ambassador Yaacob earlier this afternoon. When I remember the Bosnian conflict, 1991, 1992, in my mind, it is a ethnic, racial, religious conflict. But Ambassador Yaacob actually reminded me, because I asked him, how does a nation which has been together for more than 1,000 years disintegrate all of a sudden? For that 1,000 years, the ethnic groups worked together, lived together. So what happened? And I think as Ambassador Yaacob will now perhaps go into greater detail, the short answer was actually one of leadership, that the economy took a nosedive, and there were leaders from the different communities that then provoked the division of Yugoslavia, and that's where ethnic strife started. But we can maybe ask Ambassador Yaacob to further explain and elaborate on this point, since it does touch on the issue that Minister just talked about, between being a politician and a statesman, or someone who really leads the nation. Ambassador.
Thank you for a difficult question. Somebody told me that there are no stupid questions, that only answer can be stupid. And I hope that I will not give a stupid answer. But I should explain that from my point of view, naturally, it was a situation that our political leaders from different sides have been really unable to cope with the problem of falling apart of socialism, falling apart of the type of state that they know how to run. That was the first problem. The second big problem was influence from abroad. And for the mixed societies, like in this moment Singaporean, but maybe one day everyone will feel here that he is only Singaporean without the origin from which he became. When you are building this national identity, sometimes your neighbors can be huge obstacles if you are just trying to push in the wrong direction. And that was the case in former Yugoslavia. I hope that something like this will not happen here or never again all over the world. But unfortunately, as I said, the world knows that we are saying several times, never again this or never again that, and always the same things are repeating, starting from genocides to the atomic bombs. Let's hope never again, and never again a situation when the neighbors will interfere into the internal things of one state in which we have a mixed society or mixed communities like in this one, and as it was, and it's even now in Bosnia.
Thank you, Ambassador. Yes, can we have the next question?